Call it the new world order in college football. Welcome into the Voice of College Football, bright and early on a Friday. How about that? 9 a.m. Eastern Time. When does the Voice of College Football go live? At 9 in the morning. When does that actually happen? Well, it's happening today. It has happened a few times in the past. We will be live at 9 a.m. Eastern Time in about 3+ weeks because we will do our third annual 24-hour live stream marathon leading into the 2023 season. But that's when there's actually football on the field, as there is across fall camps. We will talk a little football and have been for the last few days. So please check out the videos that we have previewing the offense and the defense at places like TCU, Arkansas, Auburn, Ohio State, Michigan, Clemson, Florida State, and others, many others, Oregon included. And yes, many others. LSU just posted as well. Appreciate you all being here at the Voice of College Football. Let's dig into it. The dominoes are falling. And once they start to fall, they fall fast. Unless you can catch that key domino and you can change the momentum and start to push it the other way. That's what Big 12 Commissioner Brett Yormark was able to do 2 years ago. That's what he was able to do when his conference was in a unstable position, was in basically the same position the Pac-12 was in, not now, but was in a few days ago, a few weeks ago. Brett Yormark was able to salvage the Big 12 and put it in a position of strength. So we went from Texas, Oklahoma, leave the Big 12, and the Big 12 is on shaky ground at 8. If any other schools leave, then it probably falls apart. However, they were able to solidify the conference with the 4 that I certainly approved and suggested and posted. You guys know the scoop. But Brett Yormark and his Big 12 contingent obviously did not rely on my suggestions, but made what we believe to be the right call. UCF, Cincinnati, BYU, and Houston to the Big 12. That stabilized the situation, fortified the league, and now the Big 12 in a position of strength, partially, mostly due to the neighbor to the west, to the left on the map, that is in a position of weakness and vulnerability, in the Big 12 taking advantage of that. Colorado is joined. We see that the pieces are in play for Arizona to join within hours, days, weeks, regardless of when the contract is signed and all the specifics and the details and the legalities are concluded and completely agreed upon. It doesn't really matter at this point whether it's hours or days or weeks. It would take a miracle, and I believe in miracles, but it would take a miracle, and I don't know that anyone's intervening on this one in the football miracle sense, to change momentum, to turn it around, to change the minds of Arizona. That would have to be a Pac-12 deal that blows away all of our expectations. And again, welcome into the Voice of College Football. We will get into this in just a second based on the reports that have come out here in the last 12 hours. So we will dive into all this in regards to what is exactly being reported. But the bottom line is Arizona is joining the Big 12. And after that the rest are going to go in their various directions, because we're going to be down to Colorado made 9, Arizona makes 8. Arizona State and Arizona, could they play in different conferences? Yes, they could play in different conferences. We see plenty of reports that say that Arizona State and Utah would prefer to stay in the Pac-12. And you would think, why would you prefer to stay in the Pac-12 at this point? They would prefer to stay in the Pac-12. Many reasons behind that. However, will they stay in the Pac-12? I don't believe so. So sometimes in life, we have preferences that in a perfect world, we would like this to happen. But however, conditions and circumstances dictate otherwise, and you have to make the smart, wise, safe, and stable move for the future of that entity. And therefore, Arizona State, Utah, most likely headed to the Big 12. So we would now be up to a Big 16 and a Pac 6 Check out the recent live streams that we've had, because it brings to mind so many different paths that we could go down in regards to the history, what happened, what's ensued over the last weeks and months to put us in this position concerning the Pac-12 demise, the Pac-12 coming to its knees, and then the Big 12 strengthening. We've talked about all that. Not that we can't get into it again, but it just brings into mind a number of conversations concerning why the Pac-12 made mistakes. We could run down the mistakes, and probably will in the ensuing weeks, as we have many times. The Pac-12 continues to make, there's 10 or 15 different times that the Pac-12 made a decision that could have helped change this narrative, but each time, and I say this holding back criticism, because many of these times the decision is made in the moment and it's made with the best judgment. Sometimes they just got unlucky. There's that. There's sometimes you make a decision in life and it could break either way, and you've got the information in front of you, you've got sound logic, you make a decision and it goes against you anyway. Some of the Pac-12 decisions are in that category. Most of the Pac-12 decisions are no. They made a poor decision, even in the moment. Even in the moment, we talked about the faulty approach to media rights negotiations, faulty approach to surveying the landscape, faulty approach to understanding that USC is certainly the prominent and prime member of your league, and there needs to be a strong relationship there, and they are the golden goose. However, you cannot ignore what's going on in college football, and you need to act. You're in a place that's precarious, and so for the last 2 years, instead of expanding, building upon what is a strong Pac-12 league right this second, playing in 2023, was the best Pac-12 conference we saw in football in 2022, probably in about 7 to 8 years. That was the best football we saw on the field in the Pac-12 in 2022. This is not a league from a football standpoint right this second is a weak conference. We're not talking about the worst conference in college football, most likely. We're talking, and if they will be this fall, then it's because it's that close. So the on-the-field product is stronger than it's been in 7 or 8 years. Ironically, we're talking about a league that structurally and in terms of leadership was not up to the challenge and was not up to the changing landscape of college football. We'll take your comments and questions here at the Voice of College Football. We will take your calls as well. We've left the link a couple times there in the chat. We will take your calls here at the Voice of College Football. We do have an Ohio State live show coming up at 11 Eastern over on the Buckeye channel, so be looking out for that. Guess what? We're going to be back live at 3 p.m. Eastern time, and who knows, maybe earlier if there's breaking news, or I just feel like, hey, let's get on it right now. But we are currently scheduled for 3 p.m. Eastern time to talk all of this again, but we've got some special guests coming up this afternoon. Late night, that is up in the air as well. Possibly we come back late night for a triple header of Big 12, Pac-12 live, and delivering all the news and the reports and the speculation and the possibilities right here at the Voice of College Football. Before we dive into the reports that have come out in the last 12 hours, keep this in mind, and I should repost these videos actually. I was going back last night to survey how we've covered this, and it has not been my intent nor my approach to talk about realignment every day just to get views, because that would have been the easy way out. And that's been the interest of college football, to talk about realignment pretty much every day ever since Oklahoma and Texas left for the SEC. And I understand the desire of everyone, but I just didn't feel it to be a reputable approach when there was nothing going on. And most of what would have come out of my mouth, 98% of it would have been untrue, would have been complete fantasy speculation. Okay, but what we have produced in recent weeks are live streams with people that know what they're talking about. Not that they're always right. That could be clarified at another time. And of course, certainly myself. I produce videos where I take what I know based on reports and based on just my experience in the industry, and we talk about the football on the field. We talk about the football brand. We talk about TV markets. We talk about institutions and academics and culture. We talk about all those things, and I'm not an expert on those last couple categories by any stretch of the imagination, but we put it all together and then we present it to you to say, these are the possibilities, these are the probabilities, this is what I see. And we've produced a lot of videos over the last several months, despite what some people would say, and you're always going to have critics, and the more subscribers and the more views we have, the more critics we'll have, and that's fine. That's the way it works. Who really don't know what they're talking about. If they would survey the videos we produced here at the Voice of College Football, looking back 3 and 4 months, produced several videos where I said, look at what this Arizona president said. Arizona state president, look between the lines, read the intent, read the commitment to the Pac-12. However, look at those however statements, ... Colorado president, and so forth and so on. So anyway, go back. I may get a chance during this show and grab those links and post them in the live chat. But we set this up, not that I predicted it in any way, but I said, look at the rhetoric, look at the lack of confidence, the decreasing confidence in George Kliavkoff and the negotiating team there at the Pac-12. I've also consistently said for close to a year that the Pac-12 positioning has been faulty in my view. I'm not an expert. I don't run the Pac-12, but from my view, they should have struck early, staked their ground, but they saw media rights deals from other conferences come down, and they thought, hey, we can get that type of money, not to that extreme, but we can really cash in here instead of staking and understanding the television inventory. And we're not talking about streaming, just the over-the-air and the cable television that is still by far, despite the changing landscape in media, is still by far where the money is. And the Pac-12 didn't stake its ground. And everybody jumped in and grabbed ESPN and Fox, and then the Big Ten, the over-the-air networks, and the Pac-12 approach was faulty. We said that a year ago. And I believe most of you can relate to negotiating situations. We've negotiated for cars. We've negotiated for houses. Many of you have made negotiations in business. I've been around negotiations. I've been a part of negotiations, both personally and professionally. And there is always a partner and a side of strength. And there's also a side of weakness. That doesn't mean that the side that has the leverage and the strength will completely take advantage of the other one. There's a reason they're negotiating. They're interested in commodities and benefits and products and services that the other can provide. However, they have the strength. They don't need the other. The other one needs the opposite party. And that's what we had right here. These television and streaming entities do not need the Pac-12. They have a full slate, a full a la carte of entertainment, not just sports, mostly with Apple and others and Amazon. They have entertainment provided to you. They don't need the Pac-12. If the Pac-12 deal doesn't work out, they just move on and they go about their business, and they might actually be better for it. However, the Pac-12 needs somebody. They need a partner. So they're in the position of weakness, and the longer that negotiation goes on, the more likely it is that the negotiating side that's in the weak category is going to continue to get weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. Again, welcome into the Voice of College Football. Amazon links in the description section of all the videos. Here's the deal. you're going to purchase on Amazon. And I know that there's a person or two out there that will not purchase on Amazon. I'm not talking to you. When I speak in generalities, of course. Most of you will purchase on Amazon. When you do, we ask that you would help us grow the channel by grabbing the Amazon link. It's in every description section of all the videos. Grab the Amazon link and do your shopping with the Amazon link, and it helps us grow the channel. It doesn't cost you a penny, and it also is the same shopping experience. We've tested it out with a zillion people that say, Mark, it's exactly the same. I am seeing a person that I did not expect to see. I was hoping to see this guest, and look at this. All the way out and beautiful, but steamy. Well, I don't know if steamy is the right word because it's not like a sauna out there because there's not a whole lot of humidity, but it certainly is toasty out there in Arizona. We've got Matt Zemek, Trojans Wire, on the line. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. And as you can see, like, this is the only time of day when dogs can be outside in Phoenix. Certainly can't do it in the afternoon. So giving the dogs some playtime outside. But, it's in July. It was 110 degrees for the first 30 days of the month. It was only 107 on July 31st. So we barely avoided having a full month of 110 degrees. But anyway, the Pac-12 is what's burning now. And it's so striking, Mark, and everyone watching here on the Voice of College Football, that, hello, where's the plan B? Where's the contingency? Where's the alternative? Where is, in case of emergency, break glass. Where's the, emergency response to a dire situation? You're not seeing it. And of course, all of this is made possible. And when I say this is made possible, this absolute cluster truck, this absolute clown car, it's made possible by the fact that the Pac-12 has just 9 schools and we're about to drop to 8. Just imagine an alternative universe. We're on Earth 2, as people like to say. On Earth 2, the Pac-12 has Colorado still in the fold, and it's invited San Diego State, and it's invited SMU. Now, like, none of those are game-changing programs, all right? But like, you could have 3 more schools than you do now. 3 more. So like, that is a lot more football inventory. San Diego State, Colorado, SMU, 3 different time zones, 3 different notable markets: Southern California, Denver, Dallas. Like, again, alone, they're certainly not game changers. Even collectively, they're not necessarily game changers, but you can get several million more dollars per school if you have all 3 of those schools in the fold and on board. But you don't. You have only 9 schools instead of 12. And all of this is really magnifying how not adding San Diego State in late June and not adding SMU on the heels of bringing in San Diego State was just an absolutely catastrophic and really incompetent error, right? Because if you have those schools, it's first off, they convinced Colorado and Arizona to not leave. Like, oh, the Pac-12 is projecting strength. The Pac-12 is growing. The Pac-12 is rebounding. I mean, it's never going to be the same as it was when USC and UCLA were there. No one is disputing that point. But like, you can grow back the way the Big 12, after Texas and Oklahoma left, UCF, BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, like, no world beaters there, but it's growth, it's inclusion, it's fortification against any potential departures. People see stability in that. People see resilience in that. And for the Pac-12 to not take the cue from what Bob Bowlesby and then Brett Yormark did with the Big 12, to not see that, oh, that's the roadmap to survival. That's how we, survive and get, live long enough to get to the next media rights round in 2030, 2031, to not see that the Big 12 was doing things the right way. God, I mean, I've lived in Phoenix and Seattle my whole life, and this is just sad. And I mean, USC was right to go to the Big Ten. We can all see that USC wasn't just being a bunch of greedy bastards. USC was getting off a sinking ship. USC wanted out of that completely mismanaged conference. A year later, we can see that it was the right, informed, logical decision. They saw the idiocy, they saw the clown show going on around them, and they got out and they found safe harbor. But it's really sad to see this conference die, and to die with, the Pac-12 is not going down swinging, right? Like, that's the other thing. It's going out with a whimper. It's going out without a plan B, without any signs of, fighting desperately to the very end. It just seems to be, oh, Apple, buy more subscriptions, please. Hopefully. That seems to be all that Kliavkoff and the presidents, the CEO group, seem to have to offer. And, as Tony Altomore reminded us on our Pac-12 Media Day show now 2 weeks ago, these clowns had 30 board meetings in a 12-month cycle. Usually they'd have only 3. If there wasn't a crisis scenario brought aboard by USC and UCLA leaving for the Big Ten in a quote-unquote peacetime situation with no ultra urgent, save the conference type, sound the battle sirens situations, they would have had just 3 board meetings in a 12-month cycle. But these jokers had 30 board meetings. What in the actual truck was going on at these friggin' board meetings? Were they talking about how sour the dill sauce was on the fresh poached salmon? What in God's name were these idiots talking about at all these board meetings? And it just reinforces the reality that the Pac-12 is all hat and no cattle, all talk and no action. Brett Yormark, click clack. He seals deals, he gets stuff done, and the Pac-12 is just the polar opposite. It is pathetic, and it is heartbreaking as someone who's lived in the Pac-12 footprint his whole life. It didn't have to be this way. These are entirely unforced errors. San Diego State just painted a big "take me" sign saying, take us. And the Pac-12 didn't take the hint because Kliavkoff was married to this plan of grant of rights first, media deal second, and then we'll wait about expansion later. And one of the underlying things, and something that I didn't directly say in my Trojans Wire coverage, and I should have, that this is my bad, but if, and we don't know this for sure, but it does seem as though the presidents, were on the verge of a deal, but they told Kliavkoff to keep negotiating. I mean, that seems to have happened at some stage in this process. If there was a point where Kliavkoff presented what was a reasonably competitive deal and something that likely would have kept the Pac-12 alive, if this did happen, I mean, I don't think we know this 100% as a certainty. Like, we don't know the details on the price point of a deal that Kliavkoff submitted to the presidents. I think we know that the presidents rejected a deal, but we don't know the price point of it. If it turns out that, like, Kliavkoff had a deal for like 24-25 million per school, which is not the Big 12's figure, but at $6 or $7 million less, that was not going to create an exodus. If he did in fact submit a deal and the Pac-12 presidents rejected it, Kliavkoff should have said, "F you, I either resign or you accept this deal." So I didn't mention that directly, but if that actually happened, and if the Pac-12 dies and Kliavkoff is then liberated to say exactly what happened backstage, if that is in fact what did happen, Kliavkoff should have resigned, or at least threatened to resign, because he needed to be empowered to make a deal to save the conference. And if the Pac-12 presidents, who, remember, shot down the Pac-16 with Larry Scott in 2011, they shot it down. And now Longhorn Network and ESPN were standing in the way. So it's not as though if the Pac-12 presidents supported the Pac-16 deal 12 years ago, that's not a guarantee that it would have happened. But they did put the brakes on that process with Larry Scott. If the Pac-12 presidents did stand in the way of this, Kliavkoff needed to either resign or threaten to resign. And if Kliavkoff took this job without insisting on and securing full empowerment to do himself what was needed to save the conference, and if he allowed the presidents to restrain him just as they restrained Larry Scott, then Kliavkoff did not understand the job. He did not understand the stakes. He did not understand, what he truly needed to do to take this job. That is an important part of the subtext of all this in the Pac-12.
There's a couple comments in the chat that are leading toward the mindset narrative that I was just about to bring to you and will now, because you mentioned Brett Yormark. And so Brett Yormark, let's make no mistake about it, when you're as aggressive and assertive as he is going to come up with some ideas and table some ideas both now and in the future that aren't going to work. But that's not a sign of failure. That's a sign of ingenuity and creativity, and also understanding that you have to take calculated risks. I don't know that a lot of people appreciate that it's not been that long ago that the Pac-12 was actually in a better position than the Big 12, but the Big 12, with under Yormark's leadership, understood its position on the landscape and what it was capable of doing, the type of commodities that they could pursue that were reasonable and fit his vision of what they could be, and continue to do so, while the Pac-12 had a certain mindset or perspective on its status, and that certain partners or future members were not good enough, that a deal was not possibly good enough, and therefore here we go.
Absolutely. And, people, and just to be clear, I did mention Bob Bowlesby. Like he added the four teams, but then you saw Yormark swoop in and land the plane in terms of the media rights deal, getting that $31.7 million figure and come in with other initiatives. And of course, doing talks with Colorado, that in case the Pac-12 imploded and couldn't tie its shoelaces, which has happened, Yormark was ready to capitalize. He was ready to act in ways that, we haven't seen with the Pac-12 under Kliavkoff, who had San Diego State right there on a nice polished silver platter, for a modest exit fee, 16.5 as opposed to 34. And, so like that's an exit fee you can realistically cover right there for an comparatively affordable price, and didn't do anything. And it's worth noting this nuance. I've noted it before, but it's worth emphasizing once again that, even if you don't expand to 12 teams, San Diego State had intrinsic value, because if Colorado does leave, and, the Pac-12 seems to have not understood that the Colorado needed solid information on its media rights deal by Pac.
Hopefully, Matt will recognize that the feed has disconnected. So we hope to get Matt Zemek back. Matt does an exceptional job with us at coming in from Trojans Wire. So again, check out Matt's work on a daily basis on Trojans Wire. Matt, I believe you're back with us, taking a little stroll.
Yeah, I need to relocate. But apparently outside wasn't strong enough. That's a very Pac-12 thing to happen.
Well, it was extremely strong there for most of that time.
Yeah, it's weird, but Pac-12 strength is obviously very fleeting. But the larger point is that even if you don't have 12 teams in the Pac-12, the value of having San Diego State is just it replaces Colorado. It replaces Colorado if Colorado leaves, and the Pac-12 wasn't really aware of Colorado's needs, apparently, that Colorado really needed something by late July in order to stay in the conference. But if Colorado did leave, then San Diego State can at least replace Colorado, and you have that 10th team when the Buffaloes leave. And that would have been at least some degree of flight risk insurance for the Arizona schools. But with only 9, it's that much less football inventory. It's that much less stability. And so the Pac-12 just continues to undercut itself by the lack of forward thinking. That is just very nakedly apparent.
going in two different directions. The most important is obviously the future. So the obvious Pac-12 partners going forward would be coming from the Mountain West Conference. I think that's pretty obvious for all of us to see. And we've been talking about the Mountain West component of all this. And, George Kliavkoff was sitting at a SMU basketball game, to your point, just a few months ago, and it appeared to be a done deal. And we're ready to roll. And this is a new member. And here we are in San Diego State's backed out of the Mountain West, believing they had to deal with the Pac-12. So we'll get to that in just a second. But more importantly, the future. So I put this Mountain West Pac-12 dynamic in three different buckets. One being that the Pac-12, we've thought this entire time, well, they're the Power Five. They're in the position of strength. They would be picking apart the Mountain West. Well, as they continue to dwindle, maybe it becomes a merger. Or if they continue to dwindle, Oregon, Washington to the Big Ten, Cal and Stanford to the Big Ten, maybe it's the Mountain West saying, hey, there's only a couple of you left. You're joining us. What do you think are the best case scenario for the Pac-12 versus the worst case scenario for the Pac-12 or the PAC conference?
Well, so one of the main stories from Thursday night was that, the Arizona Board of Regents did not vote on Arizona and Arizona State because those two schools' fates are tied together. And, the writing's on the wall that Arizona State, the community, most of the school, most of the administration wants to go to the Big 12. But Michael Crow, who, remember, he's one of the few Larry Scott defenders and apologists left in the Pac-12. Like, he went to bat for Larry Scott the whole way. He doesn't want to go to the Big 12, but like he's going to be dragged kicking and screaming to the Big 12. Like, that's just the reality. But he doesn't want to do it just yet for optics. Like, he wants to be seen as having defended the Pac-12 to the very end. And it just brings up the point that, all right, like it seems as though Crow's delay is not going to have any effect on Arizona State's ultimate decision or direction, that Arizona State's going to be a member of the Big 12 conference. Right now, Friday morning, as we record this show here at the Voice of College Football, that seems to be the reality, that nothing's going to get in the way, that Crow is just delaying for optics' sake. But this delay, which could last into like Monday, early next week, it still does serve the purpose in the short run of giving Kliavkoff time. Now, people are going to laugh and saying, oh, like George Kliavkoff's going to be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat. Yeah, none of us think he will. All right, let's be absolutely clear on that. None of us think that Kliavkoff and the Pac-12 are ready with a plan B. But it nevertheless does create a 48, 72-hour window. And we have seen, not just in college football, but in many different sports, many different scenarios, you create 2 or 3 more days for something to happen. Sometimes something happens in that 48, 72-hour window. So, all of this reeks of, so you're saying there's a chance, like it's a maybe 0.003% chance, but it is something. It is something for Kliavkoff to work with if he's smart, if he's nimble, if the Pac-12 CEO group, has this epiphany, of finally realizing, whoa, this conference is going to die. It at least offers the chance that over the weekend, Kliavkoff can scramble and see if he can put together a deal. So when you talk about the best case scenario, the Pac-12 needs to find something with the ACC. And that's what I wrote about on Thursday at Trojans Wire, that, with Florida State very clearly wanting out of the ACC and its grant of rights, you talk to Florida State fans, they think that they can get out of this grant of rights. Now, I'm not saying they're correct by any means, but I am saying that that is the pervasive majority, if not unanimous opinion of Florida State fans, that they think, we don't need to wait until 2028, 2029 to get out of the ACC grant of rights when the exit fee is going to be much lower. We want to get out of it now. That kind of dissatisfaction with Florida State and the ACC's TV deal, it begs for some intervention. It begs for the Pac-12 to come in, make a proposal for some non-conference games, but also a merger, like the merger with the ACC, in which, and people are going to say, whoa, like, all right, USC to the Big Ten was enough of a geographical bender, or equation changer. If you have a Pac-12 ACC merger, a couple things. One, it doesn't have to be a long-term merger. It could be a short-term Band-Aid type plan, which gets enough money in the door for both the Pac-12 and the ACC to kind of soften the blow in terms of all the revenues they're not realizing. So like ESPN could do a short-term deal with enough upfront money. I'm thinking 2024, 2025, just to get through the current college football playoff contract. And then you maybe explore something new in 2026, just to save the Pac-12 and also to give the ACC an extra infusion of cash, and you create some non-conference matchups of interest. It's not a complete plan, but of course, if you're the Pac-12, you're just trying to survive. And so you would obviously look to the ACC before you would look to the Mountain West as your best case scenario, as your ideal plan. Let's also realize that as we consider the fate of Stanford and Cal, according to Dan Wetzel's reporting and Pete Thamel's reporting, it seems to be that the Big Ten is interested primarily in Oregon and Washington, not so much Stanford and Cal. Now, whether that's because Cal is just totally mismanaged, Cal is just, it's a mess internally and organizationally. And so Cal's weakness might be what's preventing Stanford from going to the Big Ten. Maybe Stanford goes independence, which, with its massive endowment, it could probably afford to do. But Cal is seems to be the real sticking point, because that athletic department is such a mess. The Golden Bears have so little money. UCLA is going to be subsidizing the Golden Bears when it gets its hands on all that Big Ten TV money. Some of that's going to go out the door to Berkeley. So Stanford and Cal, they will never go to the Big 12. The cultural rift, the cultural divide, the cultural antipathy even is so great that Stanford and Cal are never, ever, ever going to go to the Big 12. So if they're not going to go to the Big 12 and they're not going to be allowed in by the Big 10, the ACC, like, that makes sense. And Tony Altomore has talked about, how in terms of academics, research, prestige, that there are plenty of cultural fits. Like, you can imagine just on a cultural level, we're not talking on a geographical level here. You could imagine North Carolina and Virginia, prestigious schools in the ACC, Duke as well, coexisting with Stanford and Cal. Like, that is, like, they're both of the same mindsets, similar cultures, just on different coasts. But like, that's kind of a set of people, a set of administrators who would very much enjoy being with each other. So best case, ACC, and worst case, the Pac-12 will then have to settle for merging with the Mountain West, and getting that much lower level of revenue. I find it hard to think that Stanford and Cal would be willing to coexist with the Wyomings and the New Mexicos of the world. But like, if death is the only alternative, maybe the Pac-12 just has to swallow really hard and accept basically what amounts to a group of five existence.
We know that in addition to Notre Dame, there are still independents out there, but just nobody pays attention to them. We've gone in 30 years from a landscape of college football of the Florida States and Penn States and Louisville's and tons of strong independent schools, to where conferences have eaten up all of the independents, and Notre Dame's the only prominent one left after BYU left for the Big 12. But there's I'm losing track, because New Mexico State joined somewhere here starting last year or this year, and there's only a couple of Connecticut's ticketed for somewhere. So there's only a couple left. I wonder if Stanford would go independent. I wonder what the financial structure, those independents minus Notre Dame, they have television contracts with someone somewhere. They're pretty insignificant, but I wonder what that model looks like. And I'm not asking you to try to guess what it is. That just comes to mind in regards to going that path.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about Stanford and independence, like that doesn't seem far-fetched at all. Once again, Stanford has the huge endowment. So like Stanford's not hemorrhaging money. Stanford's not in money trouble the way Cal is. Cal would certainly seem to need a conference and the revenue that can come from a conference arrangement. But, Stanford has the long-standing game with Notre Dame. That is an annual game for Stanford. Stanford has a long-standing rivalry with USC. It can play those. It can play those games in the state of California. The annual game with Berkeley, the annual games with USC and UCLA. Stanford can make those into non-conference games. So like Stanford could play Notre Dame, USC, UCLA every year. You could imagine other natural matchups. And I mean, you just look at Notre Dame as a template, playing Navy pretty consistently. So like Stanford and Navy, go playing the game in the Bay Area one year, in Annapolis another year. It's like that's a fourth obvious game that makes sense. You could play like BYU. You could play, a few teams in the Western Army. You could play a few teams in the Western wing of the Big 12. You could play a few games in the Western wing of the Big 10. So like Stanford could fill its dance card pretty reasonably, and like Notre Dame has done, Stanford would be, I would imagine Stanford could get that Power 5 status as an independent. Notre Dame and BYU were held to different standards as independents. That Notre Dame was basically the Power 5 independent, BYU was the Group of 5 independent. I mean, those weren't official labels, but essentially that's how it worked. That Notre Dame had the lane toward BCS bowls and then later New Year's Six bowls. BYU didn't have that same level of status. Stanford would be closer to Notre Dame in status than BYU, and thereby would have, like if Stanford goes 10-2 in the future, it could get a New Year's Six bowl. There are much worse existences and scenarios than that. Like, so Stanford wouldn't be living the life that BYU lived. It would be closer to what Notre Dame did. It can handpick its schedule. You'd have plenty of teams that would not mind doing home and homes with the Cardinal. So Stanford being independent, entirely realistic scenario. Cal, though, is in a totally different universe compared to Stanford.
And I'm sure our football-centric audience is scoffing at empty Palo Alto stadiums, Stanford stadiums in recent years, and also the decline of the football program. But let's understand, let's not have a total recency bias. Let's understand you can win at Stanford. It's been proven over and over by multiple coaches. It can be done. You can be a decent commodity in football. For some reason, Stanford seems to hit both basement and ceilings. They don't seem to live in that 6-6 range much. They're either really good or they're pretty bad. But as of 10 years ago, they were really, really good, a near elite. And as of 5 years ago, they were a good 8-4, 9-3 football program under David Shaw. And one other note would be that even though there's no revenue in the likes of all these Olympic sports, let's understand that Stanford's an extremely strong sports commodity that's won something like 26 of 29 Directors' Cups for overall athletic success and achievement. And just to clean up my memory, this football season will be played with, in addition to Notre Dame, Army, UConn, and UMass as independents.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot in the comments about how BYU is a bigger football brand than Stanford. Whoa. I mean, now BYU is a better team than Stanford right now, no question. But BYU is not a bigger football brand than Stanford. Let's just clear that up. Let's remember Stanford made 3 Rose Bowls in 4 years just a decade ago. Hello? Do we remember that? Do you remember that basically from 2010 through 2015, Stanford was a powerhouse program at the top of the sport? Andrew Luck multiple other second place Heisman Trophy finishers. But here's the other thing. Last year, when USC moved to the Big Ten, in July of 2022, August of 2022, at Trojans Wire, I was reading and studying, all these conference realignment stories about the value of various programs. Folks, in July of 2022, Bob Thompson, the former Fox Sports executive, the other Fox Sports or former television executives, they came out and said Stanford is actually valued at $15 million more than Oregon is, $45 million to $30 million. We had a story at Trojans Wire about that. And we all thought, or not we all thought, but many thought, and I included myself in this group, in the 7 to 14 days after UCLA and USC moved to the Big Ten last summer, I thought immediately, Oregon and Washington are going to the Big Ten. Those are hugely valuable programs. Of course, the Big Ten will want to add those. It didn't happen right away. And it didn't happen right away because Stanford is valued more than Oregon is. And that surprised me, folks. So I'll admit, I badly underestimated Stanford too. So in many ways, I'm guilty of this same thing. But let's now just say it. Let's now acknowledge it, that media industry insiders will tell you that Stanford is a highly valuable television commodity. If it's worth $15 million more than Oregon is, 45 to 30, and again, that's from July 2022, and that's from industry insiders. That's not me just making up stuff and throwing it against a wall. That's from the industry insiders. You can look at our story at Trojans Wire. Probably if you do Stanford, Oregon media rights value, Trojans Wire, if you Google that, you will pick up that story from July of last year, in which you get Stanford being assessed at $45 million of value per year, or whatever the figure is, and then Oregon at $30 million. So Stanford is not worth less than BYU, strictly in terms of a balance sheet. And credit to BYU and what it's done. All right. I'm not trying to spit on BYU. I'm just saying that industry insiders will tell you that Stanford is a highly valuable commodity with the Bay Area television market, the things that it has going. And BYU's had trouble cracking through, that barrier between Group of Five and Power Five. It finally has reached Power Five, and that's great. I'm happy for BYU. Fans deserve it. I've written about how the Pac-12 was elitist toward BYU and spit on BYU and thumbed its nose at BYU, and how BYU fans have every right, to chuckle and be gleeful about the Pac-12's impending depth. So I'm sympathetic to what BYU fans have gone through. They were looked down on as second rate, and now they've gotten their Big 12 home. That's wonderful. But that doesn't mean that BYU has a more valuable program than Stanford, strictly in terms of dollars and ledger sheets, television, the bottom line. So we can be happy for BYU. We can acknowledge BYU's success. We can acknowledge the how great it must feel for BYU to be free of the biases and the restrictions placed on it by the larger system and by the Pac-12. BYU's enjoying life, and it should. But again, it doesn't mean that BYU has a more valuable program than Stanford.
We posted a series about 3 to 4 months ago. Folks, check it out. If you just go to my page, much like Matt was saying about the article you need to check out there on Trojans Wire, just do a search and look up TV ratings. And we broke down each conference. We made comparisons between networks. We made comparisons between teams and conferences and time slots. And Stanford held up extremely well. A 3-9 horrible Stanford team that was playing much of its schedule against the likes of Washington State and other brands that would not bring eyeballs to the table, to the television set. Now, what you're looking at right now, of course, I didn't prep this, so I haven't been able to filter through. You're looking at a BYU Stanford game And it's ironic that we're bringing up and making a comparison between BYU and Stanford. Now, that by far would be Stanford's lowest television output of the year when they played BYU with only 450,000 people watching the game and a .23 ranking. But let's understand, this is on the day of rivalry weekend. Ohio State, Michigan, 17 million, and all the massive Auburn, Alabama rivalry games. So nobody's watching this game as it was a dead end game for Stanford. But I'll filter through if it continues this conversation because, again, believe me, Stanford pulled in numbers that were pretty strong considering just a bad football team and against a fairly weak schedule. About half of the schedule being weak, half of the schedule being extremely strong. The other thing I wanted to hit you with, Matt, and I know this is going in reverse, but did you read anything where you could really find in reading those letters between San Diego State and the Mountain West? I was just astonished at the breakdown in the communication between, we could see it between the Mountain West and San Diego State in regards to that direct communication. But there was an underlying communication issue between the Pac-12 and San Diego State that was reflected in those communications with the Mountain West. And what possibly could have happened that San Diego State committed themselves to a Pac-12 conference that right now needs them. At the time, maybe they didn't believe that they needed San Diego State, but I was just fascinated to go through that they're at that level, at the very highest level of those conferences and universities, those type of miscommunications.
It's stunning. And, John Canzano, his reporting from late June, early July, he reported that the Pac-12 vetted San Diego State and SMU, that those were the only two schools that the Pac-12 was, seriously considering an expansion. And, at one point, Pac-12 sources, the Pac-12 insiders who, talked to Canzano off the record, in other words, they wouldn't name themselves, but they would talk. They were saying the Pac-12 needed San Diego State. So how that fell through, how that broke down, I'm at a loss, Mark. And yet the idea that the Pac-12 presidents arrived at a point in late June where they felt they didn't need San Diego State, I don't know how you can be that dumb. But maybe this isn't about, stupidity versus wisdom. Maybe this is just about the kind of thing which, led the Pac-12 to not invite BYU. Just being elitist and thinking, we're good enough on our own. Thank you very much. Like we just don't want outsiders. We just don't want, these teams from other parts of the country. But San Diego State, like it's Southern California. Why would you, turn your nose at San Diego State? BYU, as much as it would have made sense for the Pac-12 to invite BYU in terms of stability, in terms of dollars. You can see the cultural division there, right? You don't have to like it, but you can at least see and imagine, those West Coast liberals didn't want those Mormons coming into their conference. You don't have to like it. I don't have to like it, but you can at least see how that didn't fit politically and culturally. San Diego State, like, where's the baggage, right? There's no equivalent baggage in terms of things that would turn that school off, or would turn the Pac-12 off to San Diego State. It will always be a head scratcher that the Pac-12 did not invite San Diego State when the Aztecs, again, were right there on a platter waiting to provide stability, boost media rights value, and do all the things that would have increased the odds of the Pac-12 survival. It will always be a head scratcher. And, if the Pac-12 dies, it will be terrible, but maybe we'll get a true reckoning, a true account from George Kliavkoff once the Pac-12 is dead of exactly what went on in those back rooms. Like, that's the thing that I want to know. That's the thing that I'm sure Wilner and Canzano want to know. It's something we all want to know, and we should. And, and for all the Big 12 fans who are happy that the Pac-12 is dying, for all the BYU fans who are happy that the Pac-12 is dying, I'm not going to say you shouldn't be happy because, like, again, the Pac-12 laughed in your face. The Pac-12 was arrogant. The Pac-12 had a lot of hubris, and it's now getting its comeuppance. So, like, you can say that it's all deserved. So I'm not saying you shouldn't revel in the Pac-12's demise. I would only say this. There are a few completely innocent parties here. And the two main ones are Oregon State and Washington State. Like, those are not elitists. They're at the bottom of the Pac-12 in terms of the power structure. They're at the bottom of the Pac-12 in terms of any leverage, influence, any kind of sway in anything. Those are the two schools who are paying the price of what Kliavkoff and the Pac-12 CEO group have done in terms of, thumbing their noses at these outside programs, which, if they brought them in, the Pac-12 would have been stabilized and it probably would have survived. Kliavkoff and the CEO group, with their blithering idiocy and their blundering and their stumbling and just their complete inability to tie their shoelaces, Oregon State and Washington State are the true victims here, and we should all spare a thought. If you're in Corvallis, if you're in Pullman, or if you're an alumnus somewhere else in the United States attached to one of those two schools, those are truly innocent victims. Like, it's not as though Oregon State, engineered any kind of power play to keep BYU or San Diego State out of the conference. They were depending on the leadership at the top of the Pac-12 pyramid, and they didn't get it. So spare a thought for the Beavers and the Cougars this morning, even if you quite legitimately are delighted to see the Pac-12 die in a heap of burning rubber.
T-Mac, thank you so much for the contribution. We appreciate it. We will get to all Super Chat contributions. Where do you expect SDSU to fit into this new conference realignment? Hypothetically, yes, those letters were embarrassing, but still free media.
Well, I mean, right now, unless the Pac-12 can strike a deal with the ACC, which I think is like the ideal 11th hour rescue plan created by Michael Crow, delaying that Arizona Board of Regents vote for at least a day, if not a few more days, and maybe into Monday or Tuesday of next week. The ACC is the 11th hour Hail Mary for the Pac-12, but like, none of us thinks that that's going to happen. I mean, Kliavkoff and the CEO group show no signs of having the agility, the competence, the skill to pull it off. Hypothetically, though, that might be the Pac-12's last-minute rescue plan. But if not, the Pac-12's only other realistic option seems to be the merger with the ACC. The merger with the Mountain West, and so San Diego State moves into a Pac-12, which might have Cal. Like, Cal might stay in the Pac-12. Stanford goes to the Big Ten, and maybe when Stanford goes to the Big Ten, that you will then have some really intense conversations about whether Florida State, North Carolina, another prominent ACC school tries to get out of the grant of rights and join Stanford in the Big Ten, in addition to Oregon and Washington. That's probably what San Diego State is looking at. I just have to underscore that, with the $16.5 million exit fee by June 30, the Pac-12 just had that perfect avenue to bring aboard the Aztecs then. If the Pac-12 wants to bring aboard SDSU now, you have that $34 million exit fee. Like, it's just so short-sighted to have not pounced on the opportunity when it was there in late June for San Diego State.
Matt, thank you so much for being here. You are welcome to hang out for a couple minutes or
I do
jump
have
back
to.
in. Okay.
I do have to get some writing done in the morning. Yeah,
absolutely, you do.
Straight on my time.
Thanks for being here, Matt.
Sure, you bet.
Trojans Wire, everyone. Matt's going to have some tremendous work on USC as they prepare for the 23 season, and of course, all of this realignment mayhem. Matt, appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
And of course, Matt and I get together every Monday night for USC Trojans Live at 11 Eastern and 8 Pacific. All right. We did want to talk some Nebraska football. I had this scheduled and did not want to break regardless of the reports that are out there today and everything that's the college football focus, did not want to break this appointment because we've got Evan Bland on the line from the Omaha World Herald. Evan, how you doing today?
Hey, Mark, doing pretty well. It almost feels refreshing to just talk a little college football, like on the field stuff with everything else going on. It's crazy.
It does. I know that there are YouTube channels and other outlets that basically thrive in talking this all the time, regardless of what's going on, and just making speculation of everything. We reserve it until it's actually news and there is something realistic to talk about. But yeah, we like to focus on football here as well. And Matt Rule, of course, has gone to his first fall camp in Lincoln here. And your thoughts about what Nebraska needs to get done here in the next 3 to 4 weeks to have any shot of getting back to postseason play?
Yeah, they're about a week in right now. I think, some of the things that have hounded Nebraska over the last 6 years, during which time they haven't made a bowl game, would be the lines of scrimmage on both sides, offensive line, defensive line. I think they both struggled, and both are sort of question marks coming into this year, but for different reasons. Like the offensive line is a pretty veteran unit. It has most of its starters back from last year, but it has been sort of an underachieving group. And so I'm kind of curious to see what this new staff in an off season under some of these new support personnel might do for that offensive line. And then on the other side, they essentially have one guy in the trenches who has any experience in the Big Ten by the name of Ty Robinson, and everybody else is a transfer or a freshman or an unknown, essentially. So what do those lines look like as they sort of get into the season at Minnesota here at the end of the month? That's where I start. I think that's where a lot of the competition is. I will say some of the things that have occurred in camp so far, I think, have been more kind of big picture culture things. For example, Matt Rule has decided to split, at least for the first part of fall camp, split the workouts into a 60-man group of more of the veterans, and then they run through the other 60 separately with the same coaches, all in the name of development. And so I don't know how much that'll pay off here in the first month or two, but I do think long term, that's the sort of thing that Nebraska has to have. And they've had a couple of defections here in fall camp. Their tight ends coach was cited for DUI last week. He resigned. And then a starting safety from the last year and a half by the name of Miles Farmer entered the transfer portal. And mostly it was because of not wanting to, accommodate to these new standards that this staff has. So I think they're really setting a tone culturally. And then a lot of the football stuff is still starting to shake itself out here with a few weeks until the first game.
I thought that Matt Rule was the most thoughtful and the most entertaining, that combination at Big Ten Media Days, both at the podium, but mostly on the side session. And to your point, he talked about, we're going to have the most disciplined team that we possibly can have. And it's going to start with being on time, being responsible, taking care of everything that seems to be not football related. And that there's a culture, the shift that's pretty significant. I specifically asked him, he walked in a locker room at Temple that was similar from the standpoint of nobody in the room ever won anything at that level. He walked in at the locker room for the first time at Baylor. Nobody knew how to win there and nobody had won. And now he's facing the same thing with much higher stakes at Nebraska. And how do you turn that type situation and mindset around? And he started talking about very granular details. So he's a detail-oriented coach following a coach who wasn't considered to be very detail-oriented at all.
Right. I mean, and that's true. And he would be the first to tell you that his situations at Temple and Baylor were a lot more dire than what he has at Nebraska, right? I mean, Temple was kind of on its deathbed as a football program. Baylor was coming out of the scandals from the Art Briles era, and Nebraska has just been, I guess, by comparison, chronic underachievers, right? Like they have the fan support. They still sold out every home game since the early 1960s. The support structure around the football program has always been really strong. They have a sports science facility within the stadium that they utilize. Their NIL package is competitive, if not even more than that. It's just been a lot of the on-field stuff and a lot of the small stuff. And when you're in a conference that is investing in football to the extent that the Big Ten is, sometimes, and I think most times, it comes down to that little stuff, right? I mean, are you on time? Are you in the right position, right? Like, I think half a dozen players have already changed positions under Matt Rule, and we'll see how that shakes out. I think he puts a lot of emphasis on explaining to the players why they're doing this, why they're doing that, what goes into the process. And it's not just listen to what I say because I'm the smartest guy here, but there's a strategic thought behind pretty much everything that Matt Rule does or Matt Rule says. And so, yeah, I mean, you're right. It's refreshing. It's much different as compared to his predecessor, Scott Frost, who, at the time, 5 years ago, everybody thought that he was the answer. And I think, too, you talking about Big Ten Media Days, it reminded me back in 2018 when Scott Frost made his Big Ten Media Days debut, and his first year was full of bold proclamations. I think the most famous was, you better get us now because you won't be able to get us later, essentially. And Matt Rule took a much different tone. I don't think he made really any bold proclamations about what Nebraska would be. It was just a steady kind of series of, this is what we believe, this is why we believe it, this is why we do what we do. And the results, tend to come, or at least they have in his career. So I think that's a much different approach that he's taking in that regard too.
I thought Casey Thompson did a capable job last year, and obviously the offense fell completely off the cliff when he was injured. He did lead the Big 12 in touchdown passes the previous season. And when they signed Jeff Sims, I thought, okay, this makes for an interesting quarterback battle. And it didn't turn out to be much of a battle. Jeff Sims must have shown something because for Casey Thompson to leave programs like Texas and Nebraska to go to FAU. And we did have a guest, Zach Smith, who told us just a couple days after Jeff Sims was signed that based on his coaching contacts that they said Jeff Sims is going to win this job. And so I was slightly surprised, not shocked. And now Jeff Sims wants to prove himself to be a capable thrower and not just an athlete.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think the thing that also affected that quarterback race in the spring was Casey Thompson was recovering from a shoulder procedure. And so he sat out pretty much the entire spring. And that's really hard when you have a new staff and you have a new quarterback who was handpicked by that staff in the building, and you as the incumbent starter were not able to compete. And so to his credit, he was a film rat, a football junkie. I mean, he lived in the stadium doing his thing. I think he did impress the coaches and make it a little bit more interesting than maybe that they thought it would. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think he understood that playing time for a guy who's going into his final year, being Casey Thompson, was going to happen somewhere else. He didn't want to go up against kind of that handpicked guy that the new staff brought in. And so, yeah, it's been Sims pretty clearly for the last 3 or 4 months now since he's been here. The staff really challenged him and said, look, the two things we need you to do in the offseason are to improve your completion percentage and to cut down on the turnovers. And you look at his career at Georgia Tech, he's completing, 58% of his passes during his career. I think he's accounted for 41 touchdowns and 31 turnovers, whether that's interceptions or fumbles lost. And so you can kind of see a pretty wide range of outcomes with what Jeff Sims can do. I mean, he can create with his big arm and his quick legs, but he can also hurt you on occasion with some of those giveaways as well. So I think it's interesting because the view or the outlook on Nebraska this year is so wide. I mean, you just look at some of the preseason voting. I mean, they could contend in the West. They could finish 5th or 6th again if things go poorly. And I think Jeff Sims is sort of the embodiment of that, where he can give you a lot. And if things don't improve from what he's done earlier in his career, maybe that can hold you back a little bit too. So really fascinated to see what his development's like, under Nebraska, under Matt Rule.
To his defense, most of the time that he stepped on the field at Georgia Tech, at least within conference play, he was stepping onto the field with an inferior team taking on better teams.
Sure.
Typically, they were a pretty substantial underdog in those games, and he had to somewhat carry the team on offense. We got Evan Bland here from the Omaha World Herald talking Huskers football. Evan, if this team is to be successful, what are the strengths? You talked about the line of scrimmage not being anywhere close to Nebraska standards on either side, especially the offensive side. What are the strengths of this team that they could really play to this year?
Well, I think honestly, their special teams should be pretty good. They have a freshman kicker who's coming in who I think has the inside track to be the starter, named Tristan Alvano. Their punter, Brian Buschini, is one of the best in the Big Ten. He was last year as a transfer from the FCS level. And then I think, their back seven defensively should be a strength. They've got two really veteran linebackers in the middle in Luke Reimer and Nick Henrich. They added a couple of toolsy transfers on the outside in Chief Borders and MJ Sherman. And then their secondary, despite the loss of Miles Farmer, who'd been a starting safety, is still really deep. Both of their corners are back. Quentin Newsome has been a staple for that unit for 3 years now. And so he's got some experience. So I think you start in the back seven defensively. And then, on offense, there are just a lot of really intriguing pieces. I mean, the running back room is deep. I think Gabe Ervin is a guy who's in his third year who was maybe one of the biggest spring risers under this new staff. They like his attitude. They like his speed, his dependability. But that's a pretty deep room, too, when you add in Anthony Grant, who carried more than 200 times for Nebraska last year. Ramir Johnson, who was really good in 21 before sort of finding the bench last year as well. And then I think tight end, too. I mean, you have Thomas Fedoni, who was a number 1 or 2 national recruit at his position out of high school, who's been hurt. He's had consecutive knee injuries. He's fully healthy. Eric Gilbert, the Georgia transfer, we're still waiting to see whether he gets a waiver as a 2-time transfer to play right away. But he's a guy, former 5-star recruit, who could help them immediately. So that they had some pieces. And I do think that their style of offense, going to more of a pro-style attack, is going to be beneficial to them and to just their style in the Big Ten. As opposed to sort of that quick tempo spread offense that so often had them behind over the last few years. It feels like there's a vision now to maybe control the clock a little bit better, protect that defense, and shorten some games, at least early on, to stay competitive this season.
Matt Rule did say that the power run will be important and it will be prominent. That doesn't mean that they're going to line up in an I formation and try to pound people up the middle that way. They may spread them out. They'll do whatever they need to do, but the run inside the tackles has to be a foundation of this offense going forward. Evan Bland, Omaha World Herald, breaking down the Huskers for us. Evan, we appreciate you stopping by. We're just a few weeks away, of course, from the opener in Minneapolis.
Can't wait. Thanks for having me. Let's get some football.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Evan. Have a good day.
Thanks. You too.
All right. Appreciate everybody stopping by here at the Voice of College Football. And yes, this was not tailor-made or set up to talk Nebraska football early in the morning, but we already had that scheduled with Evan. I didn't want to cancel or blow off that record, so we just had Evan jump on here, talk some Nebraska football. We know that you want to hear about realignment. We know that we lost like 250 people once we stopped talking about realignment. So come on back. We'll talk some more realignment. If you have missed the first hour and 20 minutes, we had Matt Zemek on from Trojans Wire, and we had some great discussion on Arizona to the Big 12. And my thoughts right off the top. We will continue on. We want to hear from you as well. We've dropped the link in the chat a few times. Please give us a call. Ohio State Buckeyes Live is coming up at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll be back here at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So mark it down and get the notifications once you subscribe. We'll be back at 3 p.m. Eastern Time to talk more college football realignment. In the meantime, want to get to your comments. So, T-Mac, Thank you so much for the contribution. The Big 12 commissioner, Brett Yormark, is talking about Mexico, and it seems logical that San Diego State would be on the table since the campus is about 25 miles from Mexico. Okay. Yes. So why would Brett Yormark think about Mexico? Well, it's the same sort of strategy or approach mindset that the NFL had 10 or 15 years ago when they started to say, you know what, teams like the Dallas Cowboys, the San Diego Chargers, now the Los Angeles Chargers will be playing preseason games in Mexico, and we'll rotate that. But obviously the teams that are playing closest to the border, that are of the interest to Mexican NFL fans, will be the teams that we will feature. The Big 12, of course, is founded primarily in Texas. That's changing, of course, as they expand to 16 and 18 and whatever else. But Colorado and other places, Arizona, yes, San Diego State. There is no question. San Diego State is a hidden gem. It shouldn't be hidden. We've talked about them, everybody in the college football world, for months and months and months. And the Pac-12 and the San Diego State Aztecs should be one right now. That was completely botched and blown by the Pac-12. We see letters that show that the San Diego State president, whose name escapes me right this second, but the San Diego State president's communications with the Mountain West clearly showed, and the athletic director's communications clearly showed, that they believed they had a deal with the Pac-12. Otherwise, they would not have bid adieu to the Mountain West Conference. Universities typically don't make mistakes like that. There are just too many layers of power, too many communications that have to be filtered through. There are too many documents that have to be signed and approved, and all of that, and legal, lawyers involved for there to be a statement made multiple times to another conference, to the current conference, the Mountain West, that San Diego State did belong to and still belongs to now, to say we are leaving and then have to backpedal weeks later. It's just astounding to me. And we covered that at the time. Check, if you're not familiar with that, all you have to do is look up San Diego State in the Mountain West right here on the channel, and you'll find the video where we laid out all the communications between San Diego State and the Mountain West. And at a certain point, you could signal breakdown, read between the lines. There has been a breakdown between San Diego State, and not just the Mountain West, with the Pac-12. That the Pac-12 took back its offer. Think how foolish that was. And what was that? What most likely was the determining factor there? Well, most likely the Pac-12 presidents, there was a portion of them that did not want San Diego State to be in their conference. You've lost USC and UCLA. Not only is San Diego State a viable option and a viable addition, even if the losses had been, let's say, Oregon and Washington instead of USC and UCLA, San Diego State would not have been as valuable at that point because Southern California was still covered by the Pac-12 with USC and UCLA. But even if those were the two losses and Pac-12 stability had been compromised, San Diego State is on an upward trajectory as a football program. New stadium, winning, gaining viewers, all of that. And in a part of the country that, despite some of the recent issues there the last 2 or 3 years, ever since COVID, and we see the issues in major cities, especially in California, despite that, the population is still not growing at the rate that it was. California surging for the last forever, pretty much since it's been established, but especially since the 1950s, California zooming in population growth. Yes, that's leveled off, but still growing. and prior to 2020 growing big time, that San Diego State, yes. And even the academic rankings are within the range of the Pac-12. They would not be on the high end. It's not an academic pursuit by the Pac-12. This is a play to stay stable. This is a play to grab a market that was just vacated. And San Diego State in no way would replace USC and UCLA, of course, but they would bring back a semblance of that. And there would be college football starved fans that love Pac-12 football. I'm not saying that there would be a large portion, but that are in the Los Angeles and San Diego area that don't root for San Diego State because they're in the Mountain West and they want to root for big-time college football. Let's say you're a big-time college football fan in Southern California, in San Diego in particular. Who do you root for? Well, I guess you root for USC or UCLA, most likely. And I'm not counting transplants. Transplants could be rooting for anybody. And then USC and UCLA are suddenly gone to the Big Ten. Maybe you keep your allegiance. Maybe you think, you know what? I have no interest in the Big Ten. I have no interest in any of those other schools. And since USC and UCLA are not right here in the city, and San Diego State is moving to a Power 5 conference, they're my team. Again, I'm not talking about masses and masses and millions of people, but I'm talking about tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people that would gravitate to San Diego State for a number of reasons in the Pac-12 playing for a college football playoff appearance. I know that seems like a stretch. I'm not talking about literally, but figuratively, technically playing for a college football playoff appearance in the Pac-12. So I was astounded at the time of the breakdown in communication and how that all came apart. Just astounded. Yes, San Diego State is a great get for the Big 12 as well. But at this point, there's an inroad to the Southern California market. San Diego's a large that no longer has an NFL team. Now, if you love the NFL and you live in San Diego, you most likely still root for the Chargers. However, there is a disconnect now with the NFL as well. So that comes into play, that the local school, the college, the university, their football team becomes more attractive with the NFL void. Yes, all sorts of reasons why the Big 12 would go after San Diego State, even in a position of strength. We'll see what happens with Cal and Stanford. They are not ticketed to the Big 12, you would think, for all the reasons we discussed with Matt Zemek. Stanford, Cal, Big 10. I offered up a thought that Stanford could go independent. T-Mac, appreciate you being here. Where do you expect San Diego State to fit into the new conference realignment? We answered that question with Matt. Let's go to Dabo. 805 winning percentage. Will that go up this year or will that go down? 805 winning percentage. That's 8-2. You would expect it to go up. 10-2, 11-2 with a bowl victory, or 11-1 conference championship game, of course, in there. So Clemson could play 14 or 15 games. A lot of people like Clemson to be a dark horse. And when I say dark horse, I'm not talking about to a great extent, but outside that very, very top tier, since they've had two, for them, down seasons, that they could be a possible national championship contender. Anyway, the winning percentage continues to go up. It was hurt by 6-7 that first season. As a Clemson fan, I want nothing to do with the Pac-12. I understand that. That is completely reasonable. I think the average Clemson fan, under ideal circumstances, would love to see the ACC stabilized and just stay in the ACC, dominate the ACC, 14 teams in the ACC, get more money, but there is no viable path. Nobody has discovered or been able to forge a way to make more money in the ACC. That's the issue. And I know that the ACC commissioner, Chris Phillips, made a statement about being creative to determine and to discover, to create more revenue streams, unless he discovers something and they strike oil. There is no way they're going to be able to uncover the type of revenue streams that they need to make up for the sizable gap between the Big Ten and the SEC. So Clemson fans are split between the SEC and the Big Ten. And I got to think that most of them would like to go to the SEC. It seems like more of a culture fit. There are rivalries established against Georgia, recent series against Texas A&M and Auburn. There's the postseason rivalry that's formed with these matchups against Alabama during the college football playoff era. And obviously, geographically, and South Carolina is right there. You've got your built-in rival right there, and you would join them in the SEC. There's others who like the Big Ten route. But I don't believe as many Clemson fans enjoy the Big Ten route as Florida State and Miami fans. All right, Dabo with this. Thank you so much for the contribution. Dabo, Cal, Stanford, Oregon State, and Wazoo merges with the Mountain West for a new Pac-16, although I would not. Wyoming and New Mexico then offer SMU and Tulane instead. So we've got 12 teams in the Mountain West, correct? So if you add on those four, you've got 16. You get rid of Wyoming and New Mexico. When's the last time a conference banished schools? We've not seen that, and that's been talked about as a first. Would that ever be a first where schools would be banished? Bring on SMU and Tulane. So we've got a Mountain West Conference with that region, Cal, Stanford, Oregon State, Wazoo. And then you go down to SMU and Tulane. Yeah, that Tulane is a stretch, boy. They would be playing all there. And again, looking at the travel for the non-revenue sports, I don't think it's a big deal in football where you play. It's a bit of a stretch playing cross country, but we're going to see this all over the place now on a regular basis. But the non-revenue sports, I think you then, and it would be one thing if two entities merge that are in completely different parts of the country. Like, let's say the ACC and the Pac-12, what do we have left? If the Pac-12 is able to survive to a small extent, and then you've got the ACC, if they've got, and they won't at this point, but follow me here, if you've got two conferences that merge and they're in separate parts of the country, then you can build out a schedule that basically keeps them in their parts of the country. And then they only meet for occasional matchups. And then, of course, the championship game. The problem is if you've got some kind of outlier, like Tulane would be a complete outlier, SMU to a lesser extent, but Tulane all the way in New Orleans, playing everybody on the West Coast and in the Rocky Mountains, that makes it a difficult match. In all these other cases, the geography doesn't work completely, but at least there are partners to play against regionally. All right. And then thank you so much, Scott, for your contribution here at the Voice of College Football. West Virginia fan. Your Mountaineers, of course, picked to go last in the Big 12, but take solace in that the media is typically wrong. So I don't know if you're an optimistic West Virginia fan or a pessimistic West Virginia fan or a realist, but get to a bowl game this year, and we'll see if Neil Brown can keep his job. We got Dr. C coming on board here at the Voice of College Football. What's going on, Dr. C?
Hey, how's it going, Mark? Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. How are you?
I'm doing well, doing well. Hope you're doing well as well.
I am.
I guess I was going to make it brief, just a quick comment, just, seeing all this realignment and all these things going on. And I'm really kind of disappointed. It kind of seems like the last person, these presidents, board of regents, whoever's making these decisions, the last people they're thinking of are the student athlete. That's the last thing. I mean, they don't give a hoot what the student athlete's going to have to do. This USC student that enrolls to play football is now going to be in Rutgers 1 week. Then he's going to be in Penn State the next week. Who cares about classes, right? We have online or whatnot. I think the student athlete loses in this, with all these ridiculous realignments. UCF in the Big 12, West Virginia in the Big 12. It makes no sense, The SEC should be in the South. The ACC should get all the coastal schools on the East Coast. The Big 10 up north. The Big 12, the center of the country, and the Pac-12, the West Coast, right? And just keep them regionally. I mean, they're competitive conferences, but I know ultimately at the end of the day, it's about TV contracts, as the Pac-12 is letting us know.
What has allowed this to happen are a number of things. The travel is easier. Information sharing is so much easier. Like, this wouldn't have happened in the 1950s or even the 1980s because travel was more difficult. Information sharing was manual. It wasn't automatic. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. You can get the information and you can be connected to anybody. And then also the money, because the larger the money that can be secured, then if it's 1985 and USC and UCLA could go and leave the Pac-12 or the Pac-10 at the time and go to the Big 10 and make a little bit more money, well, it doesn't make sense because it's negated by travel and by geographic constraints and so forth. But when the larger the pot grows and these decisions are exponentially larger financial decisions, then it becomes equitable. Now, to your point about the student athlete, in general, I agree with you that they're not taking the student athlete into regard. It is about money. Well, with some people, it's about with the ones making the decisions that's moving the sport. They're in a position of power. The Big Ten's in a position of power. USC's in a position of power. There are certain, as you well know, there are certain components that have options. They're in power. They have the popularity to do what they want. Then there's others who make decisions out of desperation or out of being forced to make a decision to just survive. Now, in terms of the student athlete, future student athletes are going to have that choice. They're going to understand what the deal is, that they can. But I do agree with you, because those choices, if geography is important to them and staying close to home and playing most of their games close to home, those options are going to be limited. There's not going to be a conference that you can go to and stay home. All the conferences are going to be so spread out that you're not going to have that option. Now, the Big Ten and any other entity will tell you that they're going to do everything that they possibly can to help the student athlete and to build schedules that reduce travel. And I'm not going to, or I will say that I can believe that there are some good-hearted people that do have the student athletes in mind with that incentive, but that incentive is more about saving money.
Yeah, and ultimately, it's kind of, it boils down in many ways to the TV networks creating the conferences now. Yes. Because look at the Pac-12. Football is the most popular sport in the country, right? I think at one point NASCAR, had the biggest viewerships. However, the 49ers, if you look at the Bay Area, the 49ers had the highest revenue ticket sales in the NFL last year. Like I'm from the Bay Area and I've lived in the South. I've lived, in the deep South. And I can tell you that the 49ers football was as big in NorCal as in the South. Now the ratings for the in the South are huge for the SEC, right? I mean, I think only Ohio State can compete with the numbers that those folks have. Of course, there's so much more to do in California than there is, in Alabama. What is it? San Diego on a Tuesday night has much cooler things to do than Alabama on a Saturday night,
Well, just to clarify that real quick, when you bring up TV numbers, if you're talking about how many people in those various markets in the South are just watching football, you're entirely right. If you look at the percentage of people in every city in America that are watching football on a Saturday, all of them are concentrated in the deep South, except for Columbus, Ohio, and maybe a random city in Ohio close to Columbus, Dayton, Cincinnati, Cleveland at times. You're correct. However, the larger the city, to your point, there's not just more to do, but there's just more people. So it's difficult to have a higher percentage of people doing the same thing because you're culturally dealing with Asians and Hispanics that didn't grow up with college football. Number one. Number two, let's understand that Michigan, Penn State in particular, and even Wisconsin and others draw just as many fans on TV as teams in the SEC. They're just spread across the country. Hello?
Oh, I think my internet right there, I think was, there we go. Okay. I can hear you now.
You still with us? So I finished my point.
Yeah, I'm still. Can you hear me?
I think you might be on delay there.
Okay. I got most of it. Yeah. I mean, I think I just find it shocking that, with how popular football is, that the Pac-12 could not sell their products, right? And I remember, of course, USC in their prime, right? How popular that team was and how many viewers it drew. And I think in many ways, the lack of a powerful team in the Pac-12 is why the Pac-12 is where it is. Yeah. Do you think that's a fair statement?
Yeah, they haven't been in the playoff. I say this all the time, even though this isn't my approach to college football, but it's obvious from everybody's comments and what videos do well and everything that I do here that people are focused on the playoff. Who's going to make the playoff and how the playoff should be structured, and everything's focused toward the playoff. And if you're a 9-3 team and you miss the playoff and go to the Russell Athletic Bowl, then the level of interest is just down to your specific community and nobody else cares. We're so hyper-focused on the playoff. Well, what have college football fans seen over the last 8 years? They've seen 0 Pac-12 teams play in the playoff. None. Mm-hmm. Well, since 2016. 2016, there was a Washington appearance for one game. But basically, there's been the conference has been absent from the playoff and therefore absent from the discussion leading into the playoff. Largely, not that there haven't been contending teams like Utah this past year and Oregon at times that had some playoff talk in November, but much less than everybody else in college football. And then they ultimately didn't make the playoff. So yes, you've taken them off the grid in terms of what the mass conversation and attention is on.
You bring up a good point. Do you think if we would have gone to that 12 or 16 team playoff, that this wouldn't have happened?
That's a great question. That is a great question because even though they would not have been represented as highly as, let's say, the Big Ten or the SEC in the 12-team playoff. If you go through, and it sometime way back, I did post a video. Don't remember what the numbers were, but they would have typically had 2 teams in the playoff. Yes, they would have been in the playoff and playing. I think that's a great point, because there would have been more revenue for the league. There would have been more exposure, maybe because of the better the exposure and the ability to get to the playoff. Maybe some of their top schools would have recruited better, because there would have been that pipeline and that opportunity to show recruits that we go to the playoff. That's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, if on a 16 team playoff, I could have seen Utah, get into that top 8. People would have seen, Oregon get in there.
Yeah. They would have been in the playoff every year with at least one school, and probably 2 most of the time.
Yeah. Hey, I think that could have changed college football because of the interest, not just for the people in the Pac-12, but across the country, getting more familiar. Because one of the major problems that I've always seen with the Pac-12 is these incredibly late games. No one in Connecticut's going to stay up to watch Utah versus Cal at 12, starting at 11 at night, right?
Okay, this is where I have an issue with that, and you're right. You are right, but I don't know why you're right, and I mean it this way. Everybody across the country seems to be into primetime games. They actually think they're more important for some reason. They're not. The importance of the game is based on the records of the teams and the rankings of the teams. But anyway, as soon as you say a game's in primetime, people are like, oh, that's in primetime. Okay, well, Fox kind of debunked that with the big noon kickoff. But for some reason, even we're hearing now that USC and UCLA do not want to play at night on the West Coast, even though for them, that's not a 10:30 game. That's a 7:30 game. Mm-hmm. Ohio State doesn't have an issue, except unless it's, 25 degrees in November with playing in Columbus at night. So I don't get the whole, because let me put it this way. They're playing a primetime game on the West Coast in that time zone. And there are plenty of large TV markets if there's enough interest to support that. Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, Denver, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, that should be able to support primetime college football out west, but they don't.
Do you have an idea why that might be?
Because they don't like college football as much as everybody else does. There's not enough of them.
Yeah.
And people are moving that way. So the concentration of the population, obviously, years ago was in the Midwest and the Northeast, mostly the Northeast, but it's continuing to move and move and move and move and move. So the population gain in the Southwest and in California has been monumental in the last 3 decades.
Yeah. And I mean, one of those things that could have maybe gained more viewers on that region of the country would have been a dominant team such as a USC or Oregon. And then the other option would have been making the games mean something. Yeah. Seeing your regional team in the Pac-12 in the playoff, that's,
and of course we're speaking in generalities.
Sure.
People are going to bring up, and part of that is that move of people from the Midwest and from the Northeast. Well, they kept watching college football, but they didn't watch the Pac-12. They watched their team. So their transplants, our guy Tim says this all the time, our USC guy Tim, that you go out to the bars in Southern California and watch football games and you see larger contingents, or at least the people that he rub elbows with, larger contingents of Ohio State, Notre Dame, and Michigan fans than Pac-12 fans.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. I would see, when I was in California, I would see a lot of teams from outside the Pac-12, people that moved into the state or They were just fans of Big Ten football.
Hey,
or
Dr. C, I
SEC.
just realized I'm up against it. We got 3 other calls. We got Ohio State to talk about here at 11 o'clock. So appreciate you calling.
No worries. My pleasure, Mark. Thanks for taking my call.
All right, let's get to these other calls real quick. We got Need More Cowbell. What's going on today?
Morning, Mark. How you doing?
I'm
This
doing just fine.
Friday?
What's up?
Okay.
Thanks
Just
for
getting
waiting.
ready for work. And if you're George Kleekoff this morning, and you're about to get fired, who are you calling?
Well, anybody of that ilk has a lot of opportunities and response, and yeah, he's got a lot of connections. And I'm not completely like he wants to keep his job. Who are you calling?
Yeah.
Oh, he wants to keep his job. I thought
Yeah.
I'm on a personal level.
No.
Okay. Well, can't you get back on the line with San Diego State?
Well, you can get on the line with San Diego State. That's true. Well, here's what the first person I'm calling is Fox.
Oh, you're
And
talking, okay.
yeah, I'm calling the networks to see if we can't put together a deal, because I don't see the ACC thing merger working out.
Yep.
Because Washington was saying it needed an extra $10 million in travel for its teams just to join the Big Ten. So traveling all the way to the ACC doesn't seem to pan out financially. I'm sure legislators in California and Washington or Oregon are up in arms this morning because of the possibility of one school leaving and the other school running deficits. Cal has more debt than any other athletic program, largely because Cal does things like having to refurbish a stadium that sits on a fault line for $200 million.
I apologize, but you got like 30 seconds. We got to get in 2 other calls, and
if I'm George Kleekoff, I'm calling the Big Ten. What has to happen to take Washington State and Oregon State
and send them to the Big Ten?
Yep.
And then what role does he have, and what conference is he running?
He isn't. It's a merger between the Big Ten and the Pac, and you tell us the price.
Well, it's not a merger. It's not a true merger. It's a Big Ten takeover.
It's an Big Ten takeover.
Well, and he's got no play.
He's basically being the good shepherd and overseeing the end of the Pac-10 the best way he can.
Gotcha.
I mean, he's moving the schools that can go to the Big 12 to the Big 12, and he's desperately trying to find a home for Washington State and Oregon State. And the most logical
thought. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for the call. We'll be back at 3 Eastern.
Sure.
Thanks. All right. Very quick calls here. Very quick. 30 seconds. Rapid fire. What's going on?
All right. Anyways, what's up, man? Anyways,
we don't have much time.
Yeah, I get it. I'll just say this quick. I hate all this realignment. Go look on my Twitter. It's a pinned tweet. My little realignment idea. And to me, geography and regionality and rivalries is what makes college football. And this is going to work out just like how it did for NASCAR. All this expansion.
Yeah, it's a great point. I've made it many times myself. I won't do that right now. I appreciate the call. We'll be back at 3 p.m. Eastern time with another realignment show.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, TriStar. We got Rick checking in. LBC Trojan. Rick, what's going on?
Hey, Mark. I know you're up against it. I was just wanted to kind of give a counterpoint to what Dr. C was talking about with, nobody's thinking about the student athletes and all the travel. I'm sorry, but if you're going to be a D1 student athlete, you're used to the travel and your parents paying for it in any sport. Whether you're a club soccer player, you're playing AAU basketball, you're going to be a Division I wrestler, you're going to be a golf or tennis player, water polo, you are traveling across the country to showcases while you're in high school. I know this because my daughter played club soccer, and there's kids playing at an elite level in California from August until December that are traveling during school to showcases in Florida and Texas. This is what is normal. In order to become a D1 player at that level, you are used to traveling. and your parents are paying for it. So the fact that you're going to have to travel more and people in the Southeast don't understand that, because yes, I understand the schools are all closer together, but now that the schools are paying for it, you have tutors, you have academic nutrition. This is like a godsend. So these kids are used to traveling. That is a hugest misnomer that the media likes to go ahead and point out. Trust me, these kids have been doing it since the 5th and 6th grade, if they're that good.
Well, thanks for the call, Rick. We'll be back in a few hours with another round of this.
See you, Mark.
I appreciate it, Rick. Thank you so much. Hate to cut people off, but we're up against it. We've got our Buckeyes show over on the Ohio State channel coming up in just like 2 minutes. So take it on over there. We may talk realignment. It doesn't involve Ohio State, but it certainly involves the Big Ten and ramifications for everybody. When it comes right down to it, this impacts everyone, impacts their schedule, their travel, their revenue for every football entity in college football. Appreciate you being here. We'll be back talking realignment 3 p.m. Eastern time with more great guests. And again, Buckeyes Talk at 11. That means right now.